The Victorian owners of large country houses surrounded themselves with flowers. Flowers decorated their rooms, they gave colour to their gardens, they adorned their persons. With this thought in mind, I took the road to Chiltern for another season in our Victorian garden. This will be the third time I've worked with head gardener Harry Dodson. First, it was to discover how the Victorians grew their fruit and vegetables, then to learn how they prepared them for the pot. Now we want to find out how they grew their flowers. With Harry's help, I'm going to travel back to an age before today's highly technical methods of producing houseplants and cut flowers. The walled garden, its glass houses, cold frames and open plots will be put to work producing a continuous supply of flowers and decorative plants, just as it did 100 years ago. Harry, good to see
Peter, you. And you, welcome back to Chiltern.
Oh, it's good to be here. And you're getting the cut flowers in?
Yes, this is the first of the gladioli going in.
And you got a new assistant to help you?
Yes, David. Come and meet Peter.
Hello, David.
Hello, pleased to meet you.
Well, it's good to see you. And you're busy. Gladiolus gandavensis, a favourite of Queen Victoria. They're a bit small, but I suppose they're an old variety.
They're a very old variety, Peter, yes. I don't mind them being as small as that, or a section being smaller, because they throw a smaller spike, and you know, sometimes when you're decorating, you need some smaller spikes as well as the large ones.
Because they'll all be for cut flower for the big house.
This is all cut flower, and the whole of this piece of ground is going to be cut flowers for the house. There will be all sorts here. There's dahlias and the chrysanthemum maximum, and then there will be a good selection of helichrysums and acroleinium and statice, all for dried work.
Row after row.
Row after row, yes.
Because it was a real crop, wasn't it?
It was a crop, and what quite a number of people never understood was, you know, that these wall gardens were the production of the old setup. This had to be done on a mini commercial scale to keep up with the supply.
Well, it's good to see it again, Harry.
It is good to see it. I'm
Absolutely
really pleased over it. It's really nice. Well, come and have a look at the other things we've got going.
I'd love to. Have a really good poke round. Shall I go on first down this path?
David, you can carry on here. You know how far you've got to go. Yes, okay. And fill them in when you finish. Lightly tread them and rake it off.
Right.
Right, I'll go forth, Harry.
Yes,
that'll be a good thing.
Come and have a look.
Many of the plants the Victorians liked most had only recently been introduced from the tropics. They needed the protection of what became known as the stove house. Harry already has this in mind.
We realised we'd got to have a stove house, and we've set aside this house for it.
Oh, you're using this one?
We've got this one all cleaned up, and it's all ready to start taking some plants in.
Well, you made a job of it.
Yes.
How was this heated in the old days,
This was heated year in and year out, and the heat comes through those pigeonholes.
Ah, yes.
There's batteries of pipes underneath here.
Yes, and then same on the other side?
Yes, the sides will be staged up.
Yeah.
We've not made up our minds yet what we're going to do to this, but it's possible to take the top off of this and let it down onto the floor.
So you can get bigger pots,
you can get much bigger
palms,
pots in there,
that sort of thing, sitting on the floor?
That's right.
Because they always needed a lot of air space. I mean, there's
yes, they did
big
when
stuff.
they raised...
Not every plant required the heat of a stove house. In the same range, there would be cooler houses where less tropical plants were grown and their flowers displayed to visitors. Harry's show house was even now starting to fill with colour and interest.
Well, it's a great pleasure to see the arum lilies back here, and it's such a jolly good strain
They
too.
are good, they're strong, aren't they? But look at the flower you've got on this clivia.
Well, these clivias on the end, on either side, have been here all the years that I've been here.
They look it. Some old warriors, aren't they?
They are, but the middle pot is a pot of seedlings which has never been split up. Yeah. And they were sown about 5 years ago. This is the first time they've come into flower.
But what a show of flower.
I always like this colour. It's showy without being gaudy.
It's quite an unusual colour, actually.
It is. Flowers, it was a jolly good cut flower too, you know, as well as a pot plant.
Huge quantities of cut flowers were required to decorate the rooms of the mansion. The demand was heaviest when the family was in residence during the summer, but even in winter when they were in London, they still expected flowers to be sent to them. Victorian houses were large, gloomy and draughty. They needed bold, striking plants, yet many were too tender to survive such conditions. The ever-durable aspidistra was an exception. As the century went on, floral decorations became more and more elaborate, and the stands to display them more intricate. In the bedroom, roses, violets and sweet peas were selected for their sweet scent and delicate form and colour. The rose was well chosen, notes one writer, because in an emergency it can be taken for personal decoration. The Victorian ball gave the head gardener his greatest challenge. A forest of greenery set off a procession of floral trimmed gowns. The discovery that plants gave out carbon dioxide at night led people to declare such vegetation unhealthy. But no dread of noxious exhalations, intoned the Quarterly Review, deters mammas or their daughters from braving the headaches and pale cheeks which are said to arise from such causes. Head gardeners always made a careful record of what they sent to the big house. Harry's predecessor was no exception.
I've an old produce book here belonging to Mr. Beckett's days, and this goes back to just the turn of this century. This is the 20th of February, and to the house they sent 5 dozen snowdrops, 7 dozen tulips, a dozen aconites. That was a fiddling job for somebody at that time of the year. And it goes on, 6 dozen daffodils, 4 dozen carnations, which was quite something then in the middle of the winter. The next 2 items are quite interesting. Lilac and rhododendrons, 4 dozen of each. This would have probably only been the heads broken off, but they'd undoubtedly had been grown in pots, which was the principle in those days. If that sort of thing was required, a collection of those items were in the gardens.
Previously, open parkland and garden mingled in a seamless vista. Now nature was distanced from the house and formal grounds laid out. Shirley Hibbard wrote, "Since the garden is a creation of our art, not a patch of wild nature, so it should everywhere show evidence of artistic taste." But as the century progressed, attitudes changed. There grew a reaction to the rigid formality of many great gardens. This was often expressed in a romantic yearning for the artless cottage garden, with its simple profusion of foxglove, hollyhocks and lilies. The importance of flowers in people's lives could be measured by the growing popularity of the flower show. When the London Horticultural Society held its first show in 1827, few attended. But by 1842, the Quarterly Review could report that they had done wonders in improving public taste. Flowers brightened the lives of the poor. In the London parks at the end of the season, it became the custom to give away plants. Women, children, working men, and even the inmates of the workhouse brought receptacles to fill with discarded geraniums, calceolarias and lobelias. But no flower had quite the seductive appeal of the rose. Growing the old Victorian roses was a priority for Harry.
Well, come and have a look at the rose house, Peter. We've put this back into production.
You have?
The ramblers have done quite well.
Oh, this is all for cut
climbers.
flower?
10 months of the year, approximately, this supplied flowers. I've seen it in all its glory 2 or 3 times. It's had a checkered life in the last 40 years. This lovely old house was put up for the specific purpose of roses. As far as I know of, from well before the beginning of the First World War, right up until the beginning of this Second World War, it was roses continuously. The preparation work that we've done here, although some of it's been quite hard work because we've had some pretty solid foundations to break up, we've been able to incorporate this lovely, well-rotted old cow manure into the base of them. It's between 2 and 3 years old, and it's absolutely ideal for this. Well, this is one of my favourites, Peter. It's a Noisetti climber, Madame Alfred Currier. It's a lovely flower in the bud, and it's not unattractive when it becomes blown.
It certainly isn't. Now, that's what, a 19th century variety?
Yes, yes, it is.
You can see that by the form of the flower, can't you? But I mean, they're not as elegant as modern ones, but they have more character in a way.
But there's summer, you know. I like a rose like that in a vase.
It looks like a rose.
Yes, it does. I like that. I really
Not
do.
like a plastic bud.
No. It was a lovely place to bring the guests, of course, on a Sunday morning.
Ah, yes.
And, of course, it was a great privilege to the head gardener to be able to cut one off and present with the ladies in the group.
I can believe it.
Yes.
I can believe
Done it many times with
But-
various things.
Yes.
It was a great privilege, really. I was very proud to have been part of it.
Well, that's a fine plant. There's no doubt about it.
Yes, it is. Flowers have always been a thing that I've taken a great joy in growing, especially the flowers under glass, such as these sort of items. My earliest beginnings into the gardens was in the kitchen garden and the glass houses, and that was always sort of my ambition, and it was where I was always I think most at home. I think also I loved the quietness of the wall garden, and then the same with the glass. And of course you were generally a snotch above the other labourer if you was good under the glass.
The flower gardens and decorative walks surrounding the big house were known to the garden staff as the pleasure grounds. Here, the under-gardeners laboured on the huge task of filling the endless flower beds.
I never had a very great interest in my young days in the flowers in the pleasure grounds and the bedding out. And I think a few times here in the past I've wished that I had paid more attention to pleasure grain work. All right, David, we'll get the turf off.
The fashion for laying out huge formal beds in front of the house dominated the gardens of Victorian England. It's not within our means to recreate this on any scale, but Harry's game to try one curiosity, growing clematis as a bedding plant.
Now, I'm pretty certain this site that I've chosen here, with the dappled shade, and back in this bit of a nook, and on the end of the lawn, a path nearby that they could be seen from the lawn or from the path, they should do well here. The soil is not all that deep, but one of the things in favour of this particular position is not far away is chalk, and the clematis generally take quite kindly to the chalk. We've got a nice collection of plants here, 3 or 4 varieties. They've been pot grown, now well rooted, but at the same time the plant in no way has been starved, so they should do well. The soil will be firmly put around them, and they will be watered in immediately they've been done, and that should suffice for the planting. The next stage is to get some brushwood to cover the whole of the bed. Now, this again is something which I never realised they did, but having studied it and looked deeper into it, yes, they did. The bed was covered with brushwood, denuda foliage, of course. We, fortunately, have got some very useful twigs here for it from some of the beech trees which suffered in the storm damage.
It was such a storm that led to the discovery of this method. One night at the nurseries of Jackman and Son of Woking, the sticks supporting some seedlings were blown over. It was later noticed that these plants spread out their branches over the surface of the ground and flowered as profusely there as when elevated in the usual way.
It's put onto the bed roughly like a mound, higher in the middle than the sides, and the clematis, the young shoots, as all shoots will, they go for the light, and they will wheedle their way up through this brushwood.
Later, they will be pegged and trained to create a carpet of blue in the summer.
Another item, of course, which can be grown in the same way as the clematis, was roses. And we've got our bed of roses planted up here and reasonably established, and now is the time to peg them down. They need a somewhat stronger peg than the clematis because, of course, they will make some quite robust growth, and the peg has to be a little more substantial to hold it down. And, of course, again, one needs more skill in pegging down the roses. Otherwise, if you go at it erratically, you're going to break or crack some very useful shoots.
Many months were spent scouting the country for varieties which the Victorians knew, but which now seemed lost. In the case of the carnations, we were lucky. Harry obtained enough old types from a Hampshire nurseryman to give us some idea of the Victorian carnation.
There's always been quite a certain amount of trouble and problems with the naming of plants. And if you've been used to a name for quite a few years, or it's a name that you were taught when you was a nipper just leaving school, or you was clever enough to have remembered from before you left school, you found it very, very difficult to change. I suppose it was necessary, but to an ordinary gardener, quite a lot of it was difficult to explain.
It wasn't only changed names that proved difficult. Often it was identifying the plants in the first place. In the woodland behind the garden at Chiltern, a mass of daffodils gives colour each spring. Here, hidden away, is a treasure trove of old varieties. Harry's sure they go back to the Victorian period, but their names are long lost.
This is one of the later ones. Probably there are some in this orchard much, much later than this. Well, I remember them from several old gardens of my boyhood days, and my uncle had told me on several occasions that he never knew the name of them, and I took over 2 or 3 old staff here in 1947 who had been working in these gardens previous to the First World War, and they said they never ever remembered these being planted. It's quite possible that old Mr. Beckett's planted them in his early days here, but I would imagine that they were even varieties that had been around quite a few years before then.
We later discovered that some were varieties that had been bred by Peter Barr, a Victorian nurseryman who specialised in daffodils. Harry tags the plants in preparation for lifting the bulbs later in the summer. They will be potted to decorate the mansion in the depths of winter. Once the flowers have died, Harry employs a novel way of taking their heads off.
One of my earliest recollections of de-heading the daffodil was in the Vicarage Gardens. And the rector asked me if I would go and de-head his daffodils because he didn't want them to regenerate. And he took me to the hedgerow at the bottom of his orchard and cut a swishy hazel stick out, about 1 yard to 4 feet long, and he showed me how to flick it over the edge of the daffodils, and that took them off as clean as a whistle. And it had a great appeal to me because it was far easier than picking them off individually by hand.
The herbaceous border of hardy perennials went out of favour when the fashion for bedding plants was at its height. But as the tide turned against the formal bed, the mixed border made a comeback. Astonishingly, Chiltern can provide an authentic location.
Yes, well, this is where it's all going to be planted.
Harry.
This is where it's about to take place.
That's tremendous.
And what a joy it is to see this planted back up again with herbaceous plants.
Now, you say back up again, this was the old central walk of the garden?
This was the central walk of the gardens, and it was all herbaceous plants in the family colours. There was apple trees at the back,
Yeah.
and it was all banked up here. It was quite good, but it was very difficult to keep up. And the wrought iron gate at the bottom down there was put there so that the locals could enjoy the border on their Sunday afternoon and Sunday evening walks. And it was known locally as the Pretty Opening. This fine old photograph is of the herbaceous border some 90 odd years ago. It was a very difficult border to plan and to get to perfection because it was done in blue and a light straw yellow. And the other handicap was that it had to flare late July and the first fortnight of August. It truly is a lovely picture, and I'm hoping that the border that we're going to create for the new series will come up to this, but we will be having a wider range of colour in our border than there was permitted in this one. But I'm hoping to follow these lines. By the end of July, August time, I'm hoping our border will be filled in as much as this, and no soil will be visible to the eye.
In 1871, William Sutherland published the Handbook of Hardy Herbaceous Flowers. In it, he urged the creation of borders where the individuality of the plants is not altogether swallowed up in the general effect. Hollyhocks and foxgloves are certainly not plants to be engulfed and will provide height at the back of our border. Asphodels made a lot of growth, Harry.
It's done well in the short space of time that we've had it. Yes,
indeed it has.
It really has.
The little statue, is that original?
Yes, that's been here all the years that I've been here. It's a bird bath, actually.
Oh, I see
it used
now,
to be
yes.
erected each year about the beginning of May and would be dismantled again at the end of August, beginning of September.
The Victorians were passionate collectors of ferns, and they built special houses to show them off. Harry took me to see the one he'd started.
The fern house now, Peter, on our travels.
Oh, now this is a group of plants. You know, I have had a soft spot for these, and to see them together as a collection.
We've always grown a few ferns, of course, but...
Ferns were just one of the many plants the Victorians collected. The stranger the specimen, the more the enthusiasts sought it. Owners vied with each other to be the first to possess a new species. With expanding trade routes in the 18th century, new plants began to make their appearance in Britain. Soon a trickle became a flood. From the forests of South America to the slopes of the Himalayas, the search for new species took on the mania of a gold rush. Once gathered, the plants had to survive the ravages of salt air and wind on the long voyage home. Many perished, yet a journalist noted in 1842 that there are few ships that now arrive from the East Indies without carrying on their deck several cases of plants belonging to one or other of our chief nurserymen. Planting the new arrivals was often an act of faith for the head gardener.
Well, I've always fancied having a yucca. I hope we see that one in due course flower, but I don't think it will this coming year. Don't ask me what drives one on to plant things that you know you're jolly well not going to see flower or come to fruition for a long, long time, but there's something in gardeners and garden lovers that do that sort of thing.
Many plants, tender to the chill of a northern climate, owed their survival to the happy union of two materials, glass and cast iron. They gave birth to the heated glasshouse, as light within as in the open day. This is Joseph Paxton's grand conservatory at Chatsworth. It was so wide that when Queen Victoria came to see it, her carriage was able to drive straight through. These cathedrals of horticulture were the wonders of their age. Like the great palm house at Kew, they could soar to over 60 feet and admit the tallest oriental trees and the undisturbed flight of birds. Our stove house at Chilton is, regrettably, of a more modest dimension.
Well, this is the last two going in, David.
Right.
That's right. That's the right way up. They look so much better when they are put the right way up. Of course, they're very, very old. Over 100 years old, that's for sure thing. And this was the summer quarter, or the summer height, yes, for the plants. And this house, of course, would have been heated the whole of the year round, so there was always warmth through that pipe. In the morning and again in the afternoon, this would have been damped over, and the steam coming up from the pipes afforded the natural atmospheric conditions in this type of house. Come the winter, then they could go right down onto the pipes to give them that extra warmth. Or if you've got tall plants that you were wanting to force in here, they can be let down onto this other ledge. There was always beautiful plants to be seen in here, and of course it was kept so that it was an ornament to come and look at, and at the same time there was rare and exotic plants to be taken from here year in and year out to the mansion.
It was a growing understanding of how to control glasshouse heating systems that gave the Victorians the chance to bring even temperamental species through the British winter. These improvements allowed hot water to flow by gravity around a complex of pipes. This gave the gardener control over the temperatures throughout the glasshouse range. But the stokehole was one of the garden staff's least pleasant workplaces.
I was at one establishment where the boilers never went out, fruit houses or plant houses, year in and year out. It was around the clock. And there again, great skill in managing that boiler had to be got used to. If they said They just wanted to come in the morning and feel there was a warmth in the pipe. They meant exactly what they said. And if they said the house should stand at 60, 65, they looked on the thermometer and they expected it to be there, and those pipes just like that. And the opposite story, of course, came in the winter. You had to keep the temperature up to what they said. And that was just as difficult as keeping the other way round. And by the time you'd done your training, you'd been through the mill, you were pretty experienced of keeping the fire at that happy medium. Although sometimes with the gas fumes and that from the coke and the anthracite, it wasn't very pleasant.
The demand for plants came from three main sources: scientific institutions like the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, wealthy private collectors, and a growing number of commercial nurseries. This is Veitch's nursery in Chelsea, one of the largest of its day. Here plants, brought back by its own staff, would recuperate, be propagated, and their progenies sold to enthusiasts.
Tall one, Charlotte, so watch it.
A begonia, a palm and a grevillea lead the procession of exotic plants into the newly restored stovehouse.
That's right, David. Yours comes in here. When you put your hand on them, you could feel that there was heat there, and yet to all intents and purposes, there was not enough heat to really make any difference. But it did make a difference. It kept botrytis and dampness and that sort of thing out of the house. Well done, John. You got the heaviest one down.
The graceful roofs of the new glasshouses were designed to allow in as much light as possible. Their curvilinear form paralleled the sun's path throughout the day. Many plants came from the drenching forests of South America, and it was thought that rainwater was an essential element in keeping them healthy. Soft, lime-free rainwater was certainly advantageous to one group of plants. Their odd habits held a singular fascination for the Victorians.
Well, we've got a small collection of insectivorous plants here, pitcher plants, flycatchers, whatever you like to call them. They're really bog plants because I understood there was two things they will not tolerate. One is getting dry, and the other is having any other than rainwater or acid conditions.
Their behaviour intrigued scientists like Charles Darwin. He conducted a number of experiments, including feeding them with raw meat and cheese. He was trying to find out why they needed animal protein. He concluded that their boggy habitat was deficient in essential nitrogen. Consuming flies made up for that.
They're fascinating. This is the cruel streak in me. Fascinating to see the insects get trapped in them and devoured by them. The insects caught in them, of course, is their means of nitrogen supply. Some of them can become quite revolting when the tube starts to get filled up with these poor dead insects. the flycatcher here, I was surprised at times the size of the insect that it caught.
Once the head gardener acquired a plant, he had first to ensure its survival, then to learn how to grow it to perfection. The fine-foliaged plants, which became fashionable in the 1870s, were particularly demanding, as they were cultivated for the colour and beauty of their leaves. Gardeners quickly ascribed a particular technique of propagation to each plant. Begonia rex had a method all of its own.
You make the cuttings on the ribs of the underside of the leaf. And I like to put a slanting cut on about an inch and a half of the stem. Wherever you make the cut, that calluses over and in due course forms a little knobble, something like a sweet pea seed. And it's from that in due course which the young plantlet comes. And I just push that stem into the compost, and then the leaf lays completely flat and a few stones is put on it just to keep the leaf in contact with the compost surface. Otherwise they are apt to curl up and they come off of the compost and they don't root quite so easy.
Little went to waste in a garden, and the clay pots that got broken provided useful drainage for pot plants. Crushing them into tiny pieces was an arm-aching task. A purpose-built crop grinder made the job a little easier. Hard work though it was, it did produce a pile of fine dust, just the material prescribed for a potting compost.
They like a nice bit of fibrous loam, which I've got and added a little peat to, and the brick dust helps to keep the compost open, or rich, sweet and durable, which was a phrase that the old gardeners used in days gone by. This is the Begonia rex leaves, which we inserted into the box of propagating compost and placed in this propagator. They are now ready to be severed from the parent leaf and potted up. The leaves can stop here and they will produce a second crop. They are just beginning to come in the incisions we made in the leaf. I'm very pleased with them.
But not all flowers grown on the big estates were recent arrivals. Primulas had been cultivated for many years. One in particular had reached perfection as Queen Victoria ascended the throne. the exquisitely proportioned auricula. This alpine flower had been domesticated by wealthy Viennese in the 16th century. In Britain, it was adopted by the Lancashire textile weavers. Working in their cottages, they had time to nurture it. However, I found a reminder of its popularity in a somewhat grander house in Derbyshire.
When the National Trust took over Cork Abbey in 1985, they found a house full of treasures left untouched for more than half a century. But for those of us interested in garden history, the treasures and the mysteries lie outside, and there's one in the walled garden.
This is an auricular theatre, tucked into the corner of the garden. It was built by the estate carpenter in 1857 to provide a showcase for the owner's collection.
So we've filled the staging with old varieties of show auricula, and we've put them against a black background, just like they used to. And in the front here, they used to hang curtains to protect the delicate flowers against driving rain and too bright sun.
John Loudon's Gardening Encyclopedia shows an auricular theatre. It's simpler in construction, but with one sophisticated suggestion. It describes putting mirrors at both ends. The effect will be very pleasing by apparently lengthening the stage each way, as far as the eye can reach. The auricula's theatrical splendour is soon over, but when they leave the limelight, they must not be forgotten.
This is a summer plunge bed, and you would have found one of these on almost every old estate garden in days gone by. They were a very, very useful place for anything requiring cool, moist conditions. They usually had, as this is, a north-facing aspect, and they were usually made up in a box affair like this, or a frame, which was filled with, as a rule, 1-year-old leaf soil. Leaf soil of that age keeps a lot of moisture in it, and it's always cool. I think that our little collection of auriculas and primulas will be very happy here.
Not all the traffic in flowers was one way. The journalist who observed the boxes of plants arriving by ships commented that the same ships returned filled with the common flowers of England. They were destined for the colonies to be greeted with a rapturous welcome, as was this clump of primroses when it arrived in Melbourne. As the days start to warm up, the time has come to put shading on the houses. Most favoured by the old gardeners was the slatted roller blind. David's made up a new roll, built of materials from the local hardware shop. Putting up the blinds in spring was always a tricky business.
Oh, it's a bit bad. That's the wrong way round, I'm afraid.
Over. That's it.
That looks right this time. They let in a different sort of light, even on a sunny day. They let beams of light in, but it doesn't cause any scorching. Oh, that's good. Don't let it down and come down with it.
Try not to.
One of the snags with roller blinds, of course, they were taken down in the autumn and they were put back up again in the spring. It was a slow job and you had to keep your mind on your work, or your foot went through the glass, or your foot slipped off of the plank, or your hand slipped off of the blind. There was many slips that you could make, all which, as a rule, proved pretty fatal to the pane of glass underneath you.
Whilst blinds were the best form of shading the glasshouse roof, the sides and sunny gable ends were painted with a whitewash called summer cloud. Sometimes gardeners used a homemade recipe of whitening and skimmed milk.
I like to see it stippled on. It looks better, and it seems to be right all round. I have seen it in days gone by, and it is done a lot of times today. It's sprayed on. It doesn't look quite the same. On such a house as this, where the woodwork has been painted with white lead paint, it's not good to the paint. And it's best to put it on and just miss the rabbiting bars, the wood bars.
Roller blinds had the advantage over whitened panes that they could be rolled up in spells of dull weather. Given the English climate and the demands of some head gardeners, this could happen several times a day. But, as we were to find out, dull weather was not going to add to our work. Harry's marathon effort during the early months of the year has paid off. The herbaceous border starts to fill out and grow upwards. One favourite background plant was the statuesque delphinium. This is Wendy, bred in the 1930s. It's the oldest we could find, as sadly none of the tall Victorian ellatums have survived. Much to Harry's disappointment, the very year he attempts to fill a mixed border in one season turns out to be one of the driest on record. Despite an earlier shower, the grind of daily watering comes sooner than he had expected.
Everything went well until about the end of April, and then it was obvious that some of the items were suffering signs of drought, and we had to start watering there and then. Well, I'd prayed all along that the summer we had would be a normal English summer with a few good thunderstorms and a few good wet dull days and a few nice sunny days when we wanted to see the border at its full.
The huge rooms of a country house required armfuls of tall flowers. Each year this crop occupied a large area within the walled garden. In the plot Harry's earmarked, the gladiolus corms are already planted. Now conditions are right for him to prepare the rest of the ground for seed sowing.
Oh, that's great, Johnny. The conditions are perfect, and this bit of dust in April is lovely to see. The ground's worked down far better than I thought. When walking over it, it's like walking on velvet. And after all the heavy rains we've had and the total lack of frost, this has come down to a perfect condition. Absolutely ideal.
The garden writer William Robinson reckoned that the output from such a plot was equal to that of 20 plant houses. In the summer there will be larkspur, and for the winter the cheering brightness of the everlasting flowers, acroleinium and helichrysum, as well as rows of dahlias and chrysanthemums. The delicate tints of the aquilegias give the herbaceous border its first burst of colour. Many varieties had long flourished in Britain, but the Victorians introduced more species from Europe and North America. Until flowers are ready for cutting from the open ground, Harry depends on tall, showy schizanthus, or poor man's orchid, available from the glasshouse range.
They could be used in the mansions, in groups, and very often they went out to functions. For Easter, they were used in the church decorations. Unfortunately, they have been grown too warm. They really want to be in a cold house, which it is possible to just keep the frost out, and then they produce a much more compact plant, but still quite spectacular in height. They will go about 3 feet, 3 feet 6. Far, far better than the modern ones today, which they've shut down in height to only about 12 inches.
Above them hang the bell-shaped abutilons. To my surprise, one manual claims that they are ideal buttonhole flowers and good for making bouquets. And below, the aptly named cigar plant. The Victorians introduced so many plants from abroad that it's easy to forget that some were developed from our native wildflowers. The pansy, pampered and widely exhibited as it later became, was one such. It had very humble beginnings. Its ancestry traces back to the insignificant weed that grows in cornfields and hedgerows. The little heartsease had been a favourite wildflower for centuries, but it wasn't until 1814 that Lord Gambier collected some from his estate and gave them to his gardener, William Thompson, to cultivate. And at that moment, a farm weed became a garden plant. Over the next 30 years, Thompson became known as the father of the heartsease. As slowly as efforts were rewarded with brighter colours, larger flowers, and a more rounded shape. Then, as so often happens, the really important improvement came by chance. A seedling pansy in a bed of heathers. And, in William Thompson's own words, the little flower seemed like a miniature cat's face, steadfastly gazing at me. From this chance beginning, the pansy fell into the hands of enthusiasts whose ambition it was to exhibit a flower of perfect outline, well-defined margins and deeper colours. Under the fostering care of the florists, the pansy left the garden border to become the darling of the show tent. Yet these hybrids lacked vigour and became superseded by a Belgian import. Known as the Fancy, This robust strain was the forerunner of today's giant pansies. The pansy is a little fastidious, but not severely so. It thrives in a cool climate with partial shade and in a rich, moist, sandy soil. Following this advice, Harry finds the best spot in the garden for our collection to be planted out.
I think, personally, dahlia on this north-facing border will be absolutely ideal for them. We get pansy disease easy in this area, and also in a summer with a reasonable bit of sun, this land drains out too quickly, and that is not good to them. We've worked some farmyard manure into the border and a bit of leaf soil. It keeps pretty damp down here, and after about 10 o'clock in the morning, it's completely sunless.
Another old favourite improved by the Victorians was the sweet pea. It had come to these shores from Sicily in 1699, but was little developed during the following 150 years. The writer, Jane Loudon, thought it an ideal plant to be tended by the lady of the house, as it required continual watering, tying up and cutting off of dead flowers. By 1840 there was still only a narrow range of colours, but this man was to change all that. Henry Eckford, head gardener at Borreton Park in Shropshire, made a name for himself, raising new varieties of sweet pea. It was a success he light-heartedly attributed to this bent silver threepenny piece, a talisman he had always carried with him since leaving his native Scotland.
In 1888, with his lucky coin in his pocket, Henry Eckford moved 6 miles down the road to this house in the small market town of Wem. As a head gardener, he'd been so successful in growing and selling sweet peas that he decided to rent some land and set up as a seedsman.
The soil and weather conditions of the area seems to have suited the sweet pea. Within a few years, he'd made Wem the centre of sweet pea cultivation. His nurseries were extensive, and buyers came not only from this country but from overseas to see the new varieties he'd bred. America was equally affected by the sweet pea craze. One of Eckford's frequent visitors was their leading breeder, W. Attlee Burpee, seen here honouring his friend by wearing an Eckford sweet pea. The Philadelphian nurseryman would have recognised the quality of the new varieties Eckford had raised. He would have found the flowers exceptionally large and graceful, but perhaps he would have been most impressed by their colours, no longer just purple, pink or white, but blues like this Cheshire blue, or dark red. This bright orange he named after himself, and the more sober cream one after his daughter Dorothy. Eckford's achievements were all the greater, as for hundreds of years the sweet pea had resisted all attempts to hybridise it.
They're peculiar plants because they self-pollinate at this stage, long before the flowers are open. So the only hope of making a hybrid is to find some buds,
prise open the flowers, split the keel apart, and with a pair of tweezers take out the stamens. Then take a stamen from another variety, rub pollen on the stigma, and that should produce hybrid seed. But Eckford had to share the glory of the modern sweet pea. An accident of nature played its part. One morning in 1899, Silas Cole, head gardener to the Earl of Spencer, noticed that on one of his sweet pea plants, the flower petals were not smooth, but waved and frilly.
That discovery marked the next chapter in the fortunes of the sweet pea and gave rise to all these modern varieties, which are still known today as Spencer types. They took the sweet pea world by storm, and soon the old grandifloras, including the 200 varieties bred by Eckford, were neglected and forgotten. Eckford died in 1905. A colleague wrote of him shortly after his death. He walked among his sweet pea acres with toddling grandchildren about him.
Hobnobbed affectionately with such old florist friends as went to see him. Talked about the dear companions of his youth. And on his deathbed smiled serenely on the world that he was leaving, without fear and without regret. The sweet pea was grown for cut flower. It played little part in the practice that dominated Victorian gardens for most of the century, bedding out. The arrival from South America and South Africa of hundreds of brightly coloured plants stimulated the massing of flowers in formal beds. At first the style was simple, but gradually competition and the expertise of gardeners led to more ambitious designs, like this heraldic terrace at Castle Ashby. Then it was found that small tufted plants and succulents with coloured foliage could be arranged in complex patterns to produce a flat bed that resembled a carpet. This was a refinement that gave the head gardener a new headache: mathematics. Harry's taken up the challenge.
Marking out a carpet bed was something which I'd never had any experience of at all. I had read about it and I'd listened to men who'd done such a thing, and I had seen many examples of carpet bedding, how beautiful they could be. The size of this bed is 10 feet. It was only half of the size of the original plan which we took out of a book. But this book and one or two other books have never described how many plants we required. And that was going to be a monumental task, because these plants all had to be raised. I had no idea whether they were planted as ordinary bedding, where they were allowed to fill out as a plant would do and then keep it restricted, or where one planted on a colossally overplanted, I would call it, scale, and keep them starved and pinched in that position.
Because the plants were chosen for their leaves and not their flowers, they were effective the whole summer through. Some had to be trimmed to keep them in shape, but careful selection allowed patterns to be created that had the intricacy and geometric form of a Turkish carpet.
Removing the turf, of course, is quite simple. We use the old turfing iron. Something, again, a tool which I never ever really mastered, and I'll be the first to say so. Very often or after a time, my turfing iron comes up through the turf, so you better all watch out. When we've removed the turf, we will proceed to get the soil under the turf made into a condition ready to receive our plants. The centre stake, we will leave that in the middle all the time, because we've now got to mark out the plants that we're going to plant to on the border. So we'll go back to the office and we'll work this out.
This was a task not always readily accomplished by the average Victorian gardener. A writer to the Journal of Horticulture in 1861 complained that he had to get the local schoolmaster to help him out. His employer wanted a design of 3 oval beds, each to vary accurately in its proportions relative to the others. Harry's design is taken from Cassell's Popular Gardening.
This plan was supposed to be a simple and easy to work one. Unfortunately, drawing at school was not one of my great subjects. It's taken a lot of study and working out, and I've wasted quite an amount of paper on it, but I think I'm getting there.
The instructions are at best cryptic, but what Harry has to achieve is a pattern of 6 petals with their points evenly spaced around the circle. The Journal of Horticulture warned that if the points extended outside the circle, a gentleman escorting a lady had to tread with care. The lady's attention is so taken up with the flowers that she is in danger of treading on these sharp points at every turn, and the poor man must keep his eye open to save the lady from an unfortunate tumble.
We've got to mark out the pattern by moving this string across and keeping it taut on the end, and it marks right across the bed. And we move around, and in the end we will get the pattern we want. It was done by I think we got 6 petals to do. Yeah, 6 stakes are driven in, and then the line goes from the one peg right across the bed to the other. It ends up the other side, and then you move on a peg and you do the same thing again. And after you've done a few of those, then you can begin to see how it's coming. And although I have to stop and think each move before I make it, quite quickly I can see how this is going to work out.
The quantities of plants that had taken up valuable space in the glasshouses during the winter first had to be hardened off in the frame yard before being taken to the terrace or parterre. Many a gardener grumbled about the time and space they took up. Not surprising when a carpet bed could use 30 plants to the square foot.
Hey John, you start digging up the pyrethrum. At this stage, I've not had a time to really count up what we want, but it must be in the region to 2,000 to 3,000 plants for this 10-foot bed. The plan we're copying was a 20-foot bed. I'm sure the labour intensity must have been one of the reasons why so many of them fell out of being. To fill up the beds, which many of these mansions had as the years rolled by, to have done anything like that on a carpet bed scale would have been a monumental task, because labour numbers had dropped considerably by the time I came on the scene to what it was in the early part of this century. Hang on, lads, I've got a corded line to pick up in here. Well, in a bed this shape, the first plant to go in is the central plant. If you don't do the centre first, of course, you can't get into it afterwards, other than by placing boxes or something at the side and then working off of planks, which is rather difficult. A bed this size is comparatively easy by placing the middle one in first. Then we've got a ring to go around this of plants. We'll plant that ring, and then from then onwards, of course, you'll get up and work your way back out through each pattern.
The carpet bed was not without its critics among the leaders of garden fashion. William Robinson lambasted all such work as wrong and degrading to art, and, in its extreme expression, ridiculous. Ridiculous or not, few gardeners were spared the long hours of planting and upkeep such beds entailed. In the centre of each triangle, a dark, purple-leaved aeonium. The book specified a dwarf lobelia as the infill for the petal. Such close planting ensures that the soil is quickly covered. If the bed is regularly trimmed like a lawn, the design remains clear throughout the summer. The petal's outline is etched with a low-growing pyrethrum, aptly named gold feather. Finally, the gap between petal and triangle is picked out with a blue-grey succulent echeveria.
Having planted it and stood back and looked at it, I was really pleased, I really was. It had been quite a bit of aggro with raising some of it, and now to see it in the bed and see all that lot of spare plants on the grass, my first reaction, of course, was, well, with all this lot, we could have done the real thing.
Of all the tasks we've asked Harry to do for us, few will be more challenging and enjoyable than the one he now undertakes. We plan to reconstruct a Victorian wedding at the local church, and it will be Harry's duty, like that of his predecessors, to provide the bouquets, the garlands and the buttonholes for the bridal couple. Few flowers the head gardener grew were as significant as true orange blossom. No upper-class Victorian bride would go to the altar without some about her person. In the coded language of flowers, it conveyed the message that she was, hopefully, chaste and pure. Sprays of orange blossom had long been a traditional wedding flower. Roman brides wore it in their hair. Perhaps it's because citrus trees flower and fruit at the same time that their blossoms became a potent symbol of fertility. The advent of the glass house and the fashion for simpler hairstyles aided its 19th century revival. When the young Victoria married her dearest Albert in 1840, she wore a substantial wreath of the orange flower. In the previous century, bridal flowers had been mixed in colour, but soon it became fashionable for only white to be worn. Fortunately, the gardener had many flowers to choose from, like this delicate Eucharis, or the powerfully fragrant gardenia, or Stephanotis with its sweetly scented waxen trumpets. But by the middle of the century, some commentators were pleading for relief from this snowy array. These, then, are some of the flowers Harry's grown for the marriage of our Victorian couple, which we're to stage in the parish church of Chilton Foliot. But first, there's another flower that requires Harry's urgent attention. If orange blossom promised fertility, it was the rose that signified enduring love. For centuries, the rose had held a special place in people's affections. New arrivals from China, crossed with European favourites, gave hybrids that could be brought on early under glass. Specially designed rose houses were built to give them the light and airy conditions they needed.
We try not to water them more than once a week on the borders in case the bottom gets wet or to the point of waterlogging, which you haven't got much control over. The pot ones will be fed at least once a week, and these on the back walls will be fed about every other week with liquid farmyard manure. That keeps the growth going and it'll keep the bloom a good quality. They're very beautiful. There's delicate shades in them, which there's not in a lot of the modern roses. A lot of the modern roses have got set colours and they can be harder colours, but these was pinky, whitey, creamy was the predominant colours, and somehow or other it appeals. Mostly the bloom is what we used to term cabbage roses or cabbage formation like in the bloom, and the cup shape remains with them right throughout the life of the bloom. It's totally different to the HT roses of the modern ones, which almost all of them go up to a point and open out to a totally different flower.
New varieties filled the nurseryman's catalogues. Specialists grew huge quantities of young rose bushes. Thomas Rivers claimed to have 100,000 on his 6 acres in Hertfordshire. In 1858, the popularity of the rose was celebrated in spectacular style. The Dean of Rochester, the Reverend Reynolds Hole, together with a group of nurserymen, launched the first national rose show in London. 2,000 people attended, giving substance to Hole's belief that they who would have beautiful roses in their gardens must have beautiful roses in their hearts. The Victorians liked to group their plants, conifers in a pinetum and roses in a rosarium. I visited Warwick Castle, where a fine example is tucked away out of sight of the house. They recognise that when out of flower, massed rose bushes are extremely dull. Shirley Hibbard put it forcibly. A rose garden should be, in its season, a wonder to be sought, as, when its season is past, it is a wilderness to be avoided. Today, Warwick's rosarium is evidently in season. It was created by the landscape designer Robert Marnock in 1869. Using Marnock's original layout, it's been restored by Paul Edwards. The Victorians' love of geometric design provides ample scope for the gardener to display his collection. There's 4.5 tons of ironwork supporting the roses in this garden, but in the last century, not everyone trusted iron. One visitor wrote to the Gardener's Chronicle in 1892, saying virtually all the best kinds would not grow when tied close to iron supports. Well, I don't think it was the iron. These old roses were very susceptible to disease, and I think the iron was an excuse when you didn't know how to control it. By the end of the century, the rosarium fell from favour. Longer flowering seasons, the popularity of rambler roses and changes in garden fashion took the rose away from its isolated setting. Under the influence of gardeners like Gertrude Jekyll and William Robinson, formal rose gardens were grubbed up. Roses were now planted throughout the pleasure grounds, among the shrubs, and even scrambling up the trees. In contrast, despite being likened to monkeys mounted on giraffes, standard roses were always popular. Harry sets out on the involved task of creating a standard. He'll achieve this by budding the rose of his choice at the top of a wild briar stock.
I can remember at my home when I was a boy, there was a man on the fruit farm, and he, of course, naturally lived in one of the cottages belonging to the estate, and he had a small plot in the front of his cottage. His speciality was standard roses, and they, of course, were all on the old briar, and as a boy, I used to admire those roses from over the fence.
Home-produced standard roses were first sold by Thomas Rivers. He sought to compete with the lucrative trade in French imports. His success created an industry. Armies of briar men, armed with mattocks, scoured the woods and hedgerows each winter in search of suitable specimens. It was said that on some railway lines in November and December, truckloads of briars were as common as coal wagons. But it was an unpopular trade with gamekeepers who resented briar men trampling through their woods during the shooting season. In 1879, a man came before the magistrates for allegedly stealing £150 worth of briars. He was fined £1 10 shillings and ordered to pay costs.
Having got them, selected them and satisfied that these will make something useful, you've got to plant them without delay and look after them through the growing season, which will be April, May, June and July. And if you get a dry spell, see that they're not wanting for water, or even mulch them down with compost of some sort or other. And late July, August, they should be ready for budding. I'm going to select this lovely old Glory de Dijon. I love this old rose. I remember it from several old places. It was even up here on the stable block, and I think this will do us proud. First part of the operation is to make the T cut. Roll the knife around on the top first and then make the slit down the stem, and now peel the bark back. Having done that, one then has to cut the bud from the piece of budwood, leaving just a small shield which is slipped down into that T cut. It doesn't always slip in as easy as one would like, and having got it in there, it is then bound around quite tightly to give an airtight joint of this wet raffia. The bud will then stop there until the autumn, and by that time you will be able to tell where the bud has taken or not. Nothing more will be done then until next February, March, when the head of the stock will be taken off, which will allow the buds to make the new bush.
June, and our wedding day approaches. This was the most popular month for marriages in the Victorian calendar. Whoever is married during June's long sunshiny days will not only be happy all her life, but will always retain the love of her husband. How the bride will look on her wedding day, if not how she feels, will owe much to the head gardener's skill. With the flowers gathered, Harry sets about the exacting task of making the bride's bouquet.
The basics and the foundation of it was a little ball of moss, done up like a mushroom. The mushroom head of it was just a little bit larger than a golf ball, not much. And it was bound round with a bit of cotton wire or a bit of ordinary cotton, just something to hold it together. And it was moist but not wet. The flowers were wired up in what today is the orthodox way. The wire was put from the base of the stem up towards the flower and twisted around and then brought back down to the base of the stem, forming quite a firm union. Naturally, the centre flower went in first, and that went straight down through the mushroom cone. And from then on, you built around that, keeping it as even as you could, and all nice and flat, so that by the time you finished, it was going to be more or less a solid mat of flower, without damaging the formation of each flower. Each wire was pulled straight down through, and the Victorian descriptions of it was that the wires should not be twisted around one another. I thought again, because in days gone by I'd done Victorian posies and I'd always twisted the wire around, and I thought without performing that part of the business I was going to have a job to keep the bouquet together. But I found quite quickly that it was quite simple.
Finally, myrtle sprigs are placed around the outer edge, a symbol of the evergreen nature that ought to distinguish wedded love. The trails of floral garlands that trimmed the dresses of Victorian brides were not to everyone's taste. Too much sunk in greenery, wrote one observer, and covered with too much orange flower and green leaves. Freshness was of the essence, but the intricacy of the designs made this difficult to achieve.
Making up that sort of thing, of course, was always a problem, and that problem still arises today. How much time have I got in the morning? And when I thought it and worked it out, I thought, well, I'm going to be pretty pushed in the morning. If I fall over, I'm not going to be ready. This will never do. And an old method handed down to me from many, many years ago was to make them overnight and put them somewhere as cool as you could. And of course, we had the ideal place, the fruit room.
Safe in their containers for the night, Harry will refresh the flowers with a fine spray of water.
Mr. Milner, would you sign here, please, and your bride there?
The next morning, the flowers were absolutely perfect. Because the spray was so light, the flowers had absorbed that, and the flowers were completely dry, and much to my joy, they lasted the day for the bride. It's always nice to think that when you're going to part with a bouquet, it's been done with flowers of the quality which will last somewhere between 4 to 6 hours. And ours did stand the stay.
Congratulations, Mrs. Miller. Mr. Miller.
Congratulations, Julianne. Oh, thank you.
With the bride away on honeymoon, Harry has one last task to attend to.
I've received this sprig of myrtle this morning down from the mansion. Cuttings, however, have an habit of not always striking root, and I'm pretty sure there was a good many gardeners who had this failure and then had to do something about it and struck another one which did not come from the wedding bouquet. And I'm sure there was quite a number of young ladies who'd got a sprig of myrtle in the garden and they thought had come from their bouquet, and it had not done so. I just hope this one will root so that it can be genuine. Of course, before the cutting can go into the pot, it has to be trimmed. This is not a bad cutting. It's got a little side shoot, which today I will ignore. I don't think the side shoot's quite big enough to root, although it has got a little eel on it. So I'm going up to the next set of leaves, which immediately under the leaf, of course, is the joint. And it is immediately under that joint that you cut the cutting. I've placed the cutting round the edge of the pot. This was a thing gardeners have done for generation after generation, and it is thought that the aeration was better around the edge of the pot than in the middle, which sometimes can become quite wet and soggy.
When and how the tradition began is uncertain. But we do know that at the marriage of Victoria and Albert, there were sprigs of myrtle in the bride's bouquet. And there's a strong likelihood that some of these were later propagated. Legend has it that the myrtle bushes growing against the east front of Fulham Palace are from Queen Victoria's bouquet. But can they really be 150 years old? The only sure way to age them is to cut through the trunk at ground level and count the rings. And that, unfortunately, I'm not allowed to do. But whatever the authenticity of the Fulham myrtles, a royal tradition grew up. Queen Victoria expressed a wish that the myrtle sprays of the marriage bouquets of each member of the royal family be propagated. Thus it was that the myrtle in the Princess Royal's bouquet provided sprigs for the Princess of Wales 5 years later. The Illustrated London News described the dress of the bride as a petticoat of white satin trimmed with chatelaines of orange blossom and myrtle.
This is the day we've been looking for. This is the cutting which we took from the bride's bouquet on the day of her wedding. This one, as you can see, has rooted, and there's the little fine root formation around the edge of this ball of soil, and that is at an ideal state now for potting on. We're now going to pot it on into the time-honoured 5-inch pot. It will receive a crock in the bottom to give it sharp drainage, and then a bit of coarse fibre material from the loam on top of that, just a little bit of soil, and that is firmed so that there's a nice firm base for the root ball which is coming out of the propagating pot to sit on. And this must be kept intact and the soil filled around it. I hate to find anybody potting anything on and they've knocked the previous root ball to pieces. It checks the plant considerably and it takes much longer for it to get away. Gradually fill the soil in around it, firming it with your 3 fingers as you go, not the thumb. I hate again to see gardeners using the thumb to firm a pot. Finish off with a little crummy soil on the top and give it the shake on the side, both hands, and it is now potted up and it's ready to go away into the cold house. It will not, however, be allowed to get subject to frost this coming winter. Sometime by the end of next year, it should be a nice little plantlet which can be presented to the bride. In due course, by the time we hope that the bride has got a daughter of her own, it will be large enough to have sprigs pulled from it and put into the bouquet, and thus completing the cycle.
July and August are the months when the family of the big house are likely to be in residence. For the garden staff, this meant extra attention to the task of keeping the gardens neat and tidy. It's often tedious and repetitive work, but, as Harry thankfully discovers, Victorian technology came to the aid of some of the more back-breaking tasks. The first lawnmower appeared in 1830. It was the invention of Edward Budding, who took the idea from a machine he saw in the Stroud woolen factory where he worked. This had rotary blades which sheared the raised nap off felt to give it a smooth finish. Thanks to Edward Budding, Victorian gardeners never knew their predecessors' toil when close cutting large lawns with a scythe. Some of the larger machines were drawn by horse, but ponies were preferred. "Where there is considerable space to be mown," wrote the gardener's assistant, "there is nothing better than an active, quick-walking pony with a 24-inch machine, which will do more work than a horse that is slower of foot and with a much larger implement." But horses or ponies could do damage to the lawn if precautions were not taken.
This oof-looking object is a shoe for a horse, chiefly used in the spring of the year and again in the autumn when the ground was softer and it would have made quite large marks. On such a day and in such a conditions as we've been using it today, it's totally unnecessary because it's so hard and it's hardly made a mark apart from the bit of indentation on the grass. The shoe is made of leather. It's extremely well made. Underneath you've got this lovely row of copper studs and then some stronger steel studs in the middle. And it was put on the ground and the horse's hoof was lifted up and put in, and then the buckles was tightened up afterwards.
The wide expanse of lawns was one thing. The maintenance of the parterre, with its complex flower beds, quite another. Here, small machines and hand tools were the order of the day. As one writer observed, to be effective, beds cut out of turf had to have the edging of grass round them regularly trimmed so that they may always be viewed with satisfaction. But nothing was more demanding than keeping the carpet beds regularly clipped and their patterns true. And nothing was more precarious than perching above the bed on a plank suspended between two logs. There was no space between the plants for a gardener's big boots.
As events turned out, of course, we had to do it every fortnight. But then I ran into another snag which added to our problems. The dry weather caught up with us. And it was perfectly obvious that some of the items were suffering from the dry weather. So on had to go the irrigation. The plants immediately responded to the irrigation, but that also brought on the problems. Instead of running a fortnight, it had to be done in only just over the week. So it was very labour intensive until we got out of August.
In the rose house, the flowers are over, but care and maintenance goes on. Harry has suffered the scourge of a rose grower's life, an attack of mildew. To combat it, he's used the Victorians' recommended treatment of dusting the leaves with flowers of sulphur. The bellows-operated applicator is appropriately named the sulphurator. It's simple but effective.
The main problem was the dust from it. If you had a house to do, say a house this size, and it was biggish plants in there, by the time you finished, you had practically as much on the front of you and in your hair very often as what you'd got on the plants.
Taking a break from maintenance work, Harry removes some plantlets from the fern Asplenium bulbiferum. Once propagated, they will become useful parlour plants. The Victorians had a great passion for cultivating ferns. They showed them off indoors, they built special glass houses for them, they grew them in the garden. Yet of all the crazes that swept Victorian England, none was so pernicious as that of fern collecting. For 20 years, until the 1870s, hordes of amateur enthusiasts scoured the countryside in search of novel forms. They were eminently respectable, doctors, clergymen, ladies of impeccable character, yet they did immense harm, causing several ferns to become extinct in the wild.
This is the kind of thing they were looking for. Any plant that deviated from the normal. And in ferns, that usually means a distortion of the fronds. They called them monstrose or crestate. They were terms of endearment. Very much a case of beauty in the eyes of the beholder. The collectors had special trowels made with long, thin blades and curved in both directions to give them enough strength to dig into these hillsides.
Specimens were carried home, safe and fresh, in the Victorian plant collector's hold-all, the vasculum. I've permission to dig up a specimen from the collection growing on this hillside, but of course after filming, I'll replant it. The precise locations of many rare ferns were published in guidebooks. Such overexposure led some naturalists to warn of the damage being done. As a result, strenuous efforts were made to check indiscriminate collecting. In July 1888 in Tiverton, there was a case of a group of fern robbers being prosecuted. In the Museum of North Devon at Barnstaple, the Fern Hunters' Hall is on display.
A few were transplanted, but a lot found themselves dried, pressed and mounted in herbarium sheets to make up books like this. The craze produced literally hundreds of titles, a whole library of books, from the serious to those for the amateur. But it didn't end at that. Fern fronds became one of the most popular forms of decoration. When you sat at your dining table, the very cloth was embossed with them. And the bread dish is decorated with
sprigs of maidenhair fern. The butter dish, and even the Stilton cheese, resides beneath them. The silversmith joined in. The bowl of this spoon is covered in fern fronds of several species. And you couldn't escape it, even if you took to drink. Some ferns found their way to even stranger places. Fine cliffs of sandstone rock, as in nature is found, in tints of brown, grey and red, all ranged around, not as if stones piled by the workman's hand, but strikingly natural, effective and grand. Along garden-esque paths that endure for all time, formed by curves that do with grace combine, through rugged arches of rock to pass in and out by an undulating way, winding round about.
Words written not by a romantic poet, but by a builder. His name was James Pullum, and this is a sample of his work. Alongside their obsession for collecting ferns, the Victorians were equally enthusiastic about building deep ravines and high cliffs in their gardens. We may think these places exaggerated, more like a Hollywood film set than the gentle art of gardening, but they loved them, and not least because it gave them the opportunity to show off their fern collections. This is the rock garden at Madresfield Court. And if you're wondering how many hundreds of tons of rock must have been quarried to build this place, the answer's none. Because believe it or not, it's all handmade.
The Pullums advertised widely and would travel to a prospective site to assess what rocks were needed. Their commissions were not exclusively horticultural and included Brighton Aquarium, the rocks in Battersea Park, and the bear enclosure at London Zoo.
When commissioned to make a rock garden, the Pullums preferred to use natural stone. But if there was no local quarry and transport was too expensive, well, they simply set to and made it on the spot. The bulk they did in brickwork or concrete. And then they rendered that with Pullumite cement, which they moulded to create a texture and strata. They were wonderful craftsmen, but over the course of 100 years, the Pullumites weathered away in a few places to reveal the brickwork underneath.
If you look carefully, you can still make out Pullum's name scratched in wet cement by one of his workmen. A journalist visited Madresfield in 1888 and reported that the imitation is so perfect that we have to assure ourselves of its artificiality.
But it wasn't long before gardeners started to question just how satisfactory these shallow pockets in the Pullumite really were when it came to growing their favourite plants. They're a bit like flower pots, and although they hold enough soil, they hardly reproduce the conditions that ferns and alpines would experience in nature, where their roots would ramify through the cracks and crevices in the stones.
The owner of this house in Reading had his fernery built onto his drawing room. He then simply had to step into it for a stroll after lunch. Again, the ferns are grown in spectacular settings of pulamite caverns, rock pools and waterfalls. But it was the creating of an outdoor fernery that was a particular favourite, perhaps because it was the easiest to establish. As one book noted, a day's leisure and a fern hunt of an hour or two's duration will be rewarded with sufficient finds to furnish a small, hardy fernery. For our fernery, Harry's selected a small glade in the shelter belt behind the walled garden. It fulfills the conditions Victorians regarded as essential: shelter, shadow, humidity and a rich root run.
Most hardy ferns, of course, are completely happy anywhere in the woods where they get dappled shade, and usually they're quite happy to grow on the rubbish that is already on the forest or the woods floor. Anything that is coarse and porous, a fern will root into. Leaf soil, peat, fern, bracken, the roots of fern, anything like that they will root into. Hardy ferns, of course, are, as the word says, they are hardy. They will tolerate anything that the English climate can throw at them. Keeping paths clean, weeded and rolled, and general maintenance on them was a thing that great attention was paid to. I well remember once, when I was only a boy, I don't think I'd even left school. I used to be employed to go and weed certain areas of the path. It was done with a broken dinner knife, and it was a pretty laborious sort of a job. And I remarked to the man in charge that there was a weed killer would do this, and I quickly got the reply, "Yes, laddie, and if we put the weed killer down, the boss wouldn't require you." The gnats picture, it was really miserable. The lines was pretty good in there. England is a garden, isn't it? Well, better men than we go out and earn their working lives. They're grubbing weeds from gravel paths with broken dinner knives. I learned that at quite an early age.
After that, Harry had his tongue firmly in his cheek when he asked me to give him a hand with the mechanical hedge trimmer. This monster is clearly ahead of its time. It should have waited for the development of the petrol engine.
If you wind even and as fast as you can, the easier it'll be for both of us.
Oh, very good. Well, wait a minute. Let me see how it goes to start with. That's the action, is it?
That's the action,
OK,
yes.
well, I can manage
Keep it
that.
even and
I'm not sure I can manage it for several hours, but ready?
Yes.
Off we go, then.
Well, when I first came here in 1947, the whole of the edges around the mansion was cut by a tool like this.
God,
and it used to take in excess of 6 weeks.
I jolly well think it did.
But the two that used it, of course, had used it several years together, and they were a very good combination, and it really did make a very good job of it.
By which time, one of them had good arm muscles, I reckon.
Well, yes, they did.
I think I'm doing quite well.
I think you are, yes. I should imagine that somewhere about the first 5 years was the work. After that, I think they begin to get used to it and used to one another, and they did really make a good job of it.
Well,
I think you've got to hold it at a slight angle to the face of the edge.
There we go. So it's the top now.
Yes, it is, and I'm rather afraid this is going to prove that we have done the easy bit.
Is that right?
Yes.
Well, I suppose most of the growth's coming up, particularly the strong stuff.
Yes.
So
it's all muscle this time.
Very good, sir. Right. I think you've got to keep a good speed up to this top stuff, Harry. Ooh,
yes.
It's jammed, you see there.
This is a bit tough. There's no way about it.
Yes, this separated the men from the boys.
I'm afraid so.
I don't know which category I'm going to get into, but I've got a horrible suspicion it isn't going to be the men.
That's right. Oh. The cuttings fall in front of you, and then it jams the knife, and that's about as far as you can go. And
there's a bit in between the blades.
Well, to have gone through that with a machine this age, I think is pretty good.
Well, look, it's quite level.
Yes.
It shows there's skill here, even if there's not muscle.
We're improving. Let's
Off we go
just say
again.
that.
Right. Left the rest. Yes, I shall.
Yes. It's our making this one, and when it gets like this and keeps on getting like it, this is when the gardener's excuses wants to come in.
What's that then? That little stick?
They take it away and make it needs sharpening or needs oiling or get the knife out and clean the blades off, anything to get a breather. Yes, lovely. Keep the fronds behind you and then they won't get through.
In their striving after the exotic, the Victorians devised the subtropical bed. For the summer season, the grandest foliaged pot plants from the glasshouse range were plunged in strategic spots in the leisure grounds. The beds, says the gardener's assistant, enable us to obtain pleasing and varied glimpses of luxuriant tropical vegetation, otherwise unobtainable in our northern climate.
Right, set your palms down in the holes then. Best side to London, all of you. That looks fine. I've never had anything to do with this sort of planting or growing before. I've read of it, and I've thought from time to time when I've seen it that it might be a bit far-fetched, and yet the more you read it, the more you sort of thought, well, they did have something. And I can now see lots of benefit and lots of beauty to it, especially if it was a nice warm summer and there was some of the rains from heaven which kept the foliage washed and cleaned. I can well imagine that some went back into the greenhouse positions in the autumn in a better and fresher condition than what they came out in the spring. The wind problem, of course, must have always been with them. I mean, it doesn't matter how well an area is protected. A certain amount of wind gets through. And if it was too well protected, well, then I could well imagine that it would have had quite an heavy shade, and the dankness and the poor light. I don't think the subjects that we've bedded out here today would have taken so kindly to it as ours have in this more exposed and shade-free site.
Harry Dodson picked spikes of larkspur from the cut-flower border. Decorating the big house was the responsibility of the head gardener, and while the family was in residence during the summer, fresh flowers were gathered every day. Traditionally, flowers were cut while the dew was still on them, so it meant an early start.
The latest the garden staff would start was 7 o'clock, so whoever was doing the decorating was in the mansion by 7:30, and probably even before, and he would be expected to be out of the mansion by 9:30 time.
Like the butler and the housekeeper, the head gardener had his own room in the mansion, the flower room. Here he exchanged his boots for slippers.
In there you would find shelves or cupboards of the vases for different rooms and that sort of thing. And of course there was a tap in there and a sink, a wooden sink naturally in those days. And you had your other paraphernalia in there of wires and a water can and anything you wanted for flower decorating. I've been asked to make this bowl up with these lovely roses. They are the old Victorian cabbage rose, as I call them, but the bowl is shallow. I've spotted outside a box bush, and that is often used. I only need some short pieces here, and I'll place it in nice and tight, almost filling the bowl tight, but not too tight that I can't push the roses in. Modern day, of course, the bowl would have been filled with a bit of oasis and the job would have been done now. Well, I've been fussing about, working out what I'm going to do. The roses are selected and they're pushed around the vase. They're touching one another, but they're not pressed in. They're allowed to develop, which they will do within an hour or two of being in this bowl of roses. They're now going to be placed in a basket, which will be taken to the room which we're decorating and placed in its position.
Glass pedestals were popular with the Victorians. In this shallow crystal dish, pale pink roses and passion flowers are fringed with fern.
This lovely little plant is known as pilea. In my young days, they were grown in large numbers. Anywhere where a group of plants was staged or in tubs, anything where a pot needed covering, this was the ideal plant to cover the pots. It came down to the carpet. It was perfect. It had one snag as an house plant. After it had been in a warm room for a few days, the little flowers on it became dry and just the least little touch, then they popped off, and it was known to gardeners as the artillery plant. But cheeky journeymen who used to have to go in the mansion and help the foremans and the head gardener to do the decorating used to love to annoy the housemaids and give it a flick. I've done it myself many occasions, and it was known to young journeymen as housemaids' delight. But the housemaids didn't consider it very delightful. It was quite a problem to get those little pieces out of the carpet. Sometimes in my younger days I used to be rather naughty. If one of the servants, one of the housemaids was cleaning up or anything, I would say good morning to her or pass some nicety return, and if she wasn't looking or was inattentive, I would put the flowers in her pocket.
The ladies' boudoir had also to be decorated each day. Here, only the most delicate and sweet-scented flowers were used. But no flowers were to be found in a gentleman's dressing room. Flowers encouraged indolence, and that, warned a correspondent to the cottage gardener, made the body like Mrs. What's-her-name's tea, so weak it couldn't run up the spout. In the pleasure grounds, the bed of clematis Harry planted earlier in the year has produced a spectacular show, fulfilling its promise of providing a carpet of blue. Elsewhere in the garden, everything's reaching its peak. As the summer sun burns down, conditions become too extreme, even in the stove house. Maintaining a good growing environment requires almost hourly attention. The temperature can be controlled by ventilating and shading, but it's easy to overdo it. Plants need light, and open vents mean a drop in humidity.
The feelings that one should have when you came into a tropical house like this was a slight feeling that you was passing into a bathroom where somebody about 20 minutes or so ago had a bath in, and the atmosphere nice and warm in there, and yet that warmth had sort of a nice dampy warm. When one had seen to the watering of the actual plants, then the floors were damped down. That gave the humidity and it gave a nice growing condition. And again, without you'd been through the mill, you can't really get to grips of what that growing condition is. So you had to watch the temperature and move the top ventilator up as the temperature went up. But you never put so much air on that the house became arid and dry and sort of burny in the atmosphere.
Next to the stove house, the cooler show house is home to plants recuperating after a spell in the mansion. Harry deadheads the giant Campanula pyramidalis, or chimney plant. It recently graced the front hall. Now it needs some restoration work.
I'm making this plant presentable for another use. We've had to take it out of the house because it looks tatty. But if you cut these little dead blooms off, underneath there's another crop of buds to come along, and it gives this plant another lease of life. This can be done at least twice to it. It's a job that was given to young journeymen, and it was what we termed as a quiet job. It was a bit of a Solomon's on the side, actually. But it was something well worth doing. They often were used in groups in the front hall and at the end of passages, something that would take the plant with this height.
Not all Victorian interiors were as elegant as this. In 1856, Shirley Hibbard published his Rustic Adornments for Homes of Taste, which described all manner of ways of using plants. Ivy was a favourite, trained round mirrors, or used in grander style when it could appear to grow out of the furniture.
If they'd wanted to sit in the middle of a shrubbery, you'd have thought they'd have gone into the garden. I like ivy, but some people might find this a bit oppressive. There's one thing we can be certain about. ivy would have stood the gloom of a Victorian drawing room. As my book tells me, ivy grows well in the shade and may be employed for trailing around sofas and couches, positions in which its beauty is seen to the best advantage. Well, like it or not, sitting here, you can't escape it.
The gladiolus graced many a Victorian room. The gardener's assistant noted that the French florists were among the first to take it in hand. Now English razors have a decided lead. This is the variety Hunting Song. In the large country houses, rooms were spacious and airy, so flowers and plants survived. It was less easy to keep them going in the towns. The fumes from coal fires and later gas lighting polluted the atmosphere and could be harmful to plants. In 1830, a keen amateur naturalist, Dr. Nathaniel Ward, made a chance discovery that was to offer a solution to the problem. At the time, he was studying the life cycle of a moth. Having patiently waited for one of these chaps to pupate before turning into a moth, he took the chrysalis and buried it in a jar which we're told had a close-fitting lid. History doesn't record what happened to the pupa, but Ward reported that after a time a speck of vegetation appeared on the surface of the mould, and to my surprise turned out to be a fern and a grass. He concluded that if a sealed vessel was kept in the light, it could sustain plant life indefinitely. At the Society of Apothecaries, he showed members that water taken up by the roots evaporated through the leaves, condensed, and ran down the vessel to re-wet the compost. Ward's discovery had a number of practical applications. Plants now had a greater chance of survival on long sea voyages, safe from the harmful effects of salt spray. In smoky, gas-permeated drawing rooms, whole plant collections could be grown and enjoyed. Here, the simple glazed box became a decorative piece of furniture. It protected not only from pollution, but from overzealous maids who flung open windows in the depths of winter. This is one of the very few cases that has survived. It's simple and elegant, but it does have one additional feature, this reservoir. And that was necessary because, unlike Dr. Ward's original case, this one's not hermetically sealed. And that makes us think that it's a little more recent. Dr. Ward's was a closed world, but by the end of the century, a number of clean air measures had improved conditions in London. These allowed elaborate, well-ventilated conservatories and simpler window cases to sprout from the facades of Kensington and Belgravia. This one survived at the former home of Punch cartoonist Lindley Sambourne. The window case was an extension of the room and provided a pleasing glimpse of natural greenery from the comfort of one's drawing room chair.
And in the largest and most elaborate, they even built an aquarium.
But of all the plants used, it was the palm and the tree fern that the Victorians found most majestic. Their statuesque symmetry matched the grandeur of staterooms and entrance halls. But even with such lofty spaces, it was sometimes necessary to reduce their height. Doing this required skill and patience.
Lovely old fern, David. It's served lots of useful purposes. It's still very ornamental, but it's unusable as far as we're concerned. Can't possibly take a thing like this to the mansion. We've no staging we can put it up on because we've no further room for it. And we've not got the type of conservatory where we can plant it in the floor and let it grow on. So we're going to try and bring it down to our size and turn it into a useful plant that we can take to the mansion, or we can use in here from time to time, or take it and use it in other groups. It's a method known as Mar Cottage. I've never heard of it. Don't ask me too many questions about it. I still prefer to call the method, as I've known it for many other subjects, layering by approach. But before we get that far, we've got to start pulling some of this off. This has got to be pulled off. You'll probably need a knife. There's quite a bit to pull away here, but if you pull it down and you use the knife to work behind it, and then it will go down to the joint from which it originally came. Next, you've got all this fluffy material, which is like the hairs on a stem. This has to be taken away, taken right down to the little black roots, which you can see below me, are underneath these hairs. You can see the little black roots that I've been talking about are all coming through. And they should be ready to go as soon as we get the pot on.
Right.
Well, we'll drive a stake in each now. We've got to go fairly well back. I should think that's about right if I turn my stake up the right way. I'm at the bottom, if you are.
I think that's it.
Oh, that's lovely. If we can get that tied in position, that will hold the top, which is the piece we require in due course. Now we need a little extra strength to the string here. Otherwise, we'll have it toppling over. There we are. Now we're ready for the next stage.
Right.
We clear our mess off the top of the pot, make it look gardener-like. That's right. Well, it looks as if something's going to happen to it, doesn't it?
With the fern secure, the next stage is to make a saw cut halfway through the trunk at a point below the exposed roots.
That's right, David. Now the next and last stage, get the pots into position. Mine's firm, yours all right?
Now Harry sets about providing conditions which will encourage the roots above the saw cut to develop.
That's right, make the pot fit if you can. Yes. We've got half a plant in the back here. Can you hold it at that while I secure it?
Yeah.
fingers out of the way. That seems to have got it. I'll throw my end in there. Now, this is the most difficult one of all to do. David, if we can get this around here, that piece of string's to stay where it is. Now,
Right, got it.
if you can hold that at that, and I can secure this string, then we can start putting a little tension on these two tail ends, which should hold the bottom of the pot in.
Right.
There's a good double knot there. I've got mine. They don't move. Hold it so. There's my escape. Well, this is the final string, David, and it should keep the tension on the bottom of our pot. If I put a couple of half hitches around that stump, that should keep it all right. That's got that. That should hold it now. Now we're ready to put the compost in. The compost is a fibrous loam, a bit of sphagnum moss, a good bit of leaf soil, a bit of charcoal for sweetness. If you can keep the pot steady, while I put the base in nice and even. I knew I'd kept the hammer for some purpose.
With a suitable compost packed around its trunk, the fern will slowly replace its old root system with a new one.
Well, I think that's the niceties taken care of, David. Now if you pass me the water pot. Yes, this must be kept moist from now on, David. It won't get waterlogged because of the porous nature of the compost, but it must be kept moist. Well, I think that'll do now. If you like to pick up the basket, I think we can safely leave it now.
The new roots take several months to grow, but when well advanced, the trunk is sawn through. Cut down to size, the plant's elegant proportions will once more be the centre of attraction. The demands of the houseplants have not made Harry neglect the garden. He takes me to see the herbaceous border, which is now at its best.
Well, it's a few months since we were here, Harry.
It certainly is, isn't it?
Looking at this border.
Yes, lots have happened since then. This is my pride and joy to see this corner do so well as it has. It used to be herbaceous, but unfortunately the herbaceous didn't run to planting.
No, so it's annuals, is it?
It's annuals.
But they're colourful, aren't they?
They are. I'm very pleased with it.
And don't they go well against that old wall?
Yes, they do. They do fit well with the wall.
Well, that's skillful colour choice.
Yes. Come and see these lilies, Peter.
It's the white form.
Yeah, it's the white form of speciosum.
Oh, they really are.
They are. I like the bit of green in the flower too.
Yes, yes, and that almost sort of warted effect. Oh, they're
pot
beautiful.
plant, good cut flower.
Well, it's a grand show of colour and in a difficult year.
It's been a difficult year. It's been all we didn't require for this sort of planting.
Almost drought from start to finish.
Well, it was, yes. Oh, yes. Yeah, we were watering in right from the very beginning.
Well, because some things do well in the first year, but others, I suppose, have, made only a third of the growth?
Yes, that's all. Like this old miscanthus, you see, it's done nothing. It was a real pain in the neck. Look at there's a miserable little clump of it.
They always said that herbaceous borders were at their best in their second and third year.
Yes. Oh, so they were. That was the ideal.
I don't think there's much to complain about here, you know.
Oh, well, it's nice to hear you say that.
And you've got this old chap to still keep your eye on you.
He's still going, no doubt about it. He's lovely, isn't he? He really is.
As the dog days of summer settle over the garden, Harry Dodson gathers one flower that brings colour when most have faded. The first varieties of Michaelmas daisy were described as great, straggling, gawky things.
For some reason or other, they've fallen very much out of vogue these last 20, 30 years. There are several reasons for this. Chrysanthemums are much more advanced today than they were. They're a much better subject. Nearly all stocks of Michaelmas daisies get the mildew, which makes them pretty unsightly in a bed, and a bit of a job in floral decorations because you've got to pick all those leaves off.
At the end of the last century, the Michaelmas daisy found a champion in the head gardener at Aldenham House in Hertfordshire. Edwin Beckett's trial grounds presented autumn visitors with a mass display of colour from over 200 varieties. Edwin was the brother of Charles Beckett, Harry's predecessor at Chiltern.
Naturally, I'd never met either of them, but I did have the honour of meeting Mr. Charles Beckett's son on an occasion or two. So to have the Michaelmas daisies here bearing the name and the breeding of Beckett, it's something to be pleased and rather proud of.
A valuable cut flower that filled the void left by the fading summer colours was the dahlia. The dahlia was introduced from Mexico in 1804. The original types had single flowers, but gardeners soon bred double forms, from which almost spherical blooms gradually evolved. As the evenings draw in and night frosts return, artificial heat from the depths of the stokehole must replace the warmth of summer. At the same time, the head gardener must give thought to how he will produce flowers during the dark days of winter. Ashes are collected to cover pots of bulbs. Unlike soil, ashes are free from slugs and snails, who would no doubt welcome being put above a free food supply.
All the way, David. One of the Friday tasks on most of these old places was for a couple of men, or a man and a boy, whoever's task it was to get the ashes and the clinkers out of the stokeholes where coke or anthracite was burnt. Now, these ashes played a very, very important part in the gardens. The bulbs in those days, the hyacinths, the daffodils and the grape hyacinths, Dutch iris, all sorts of things in the bulb line were potted up in August, and they were put into a particular bed which was known as a plunge bed for those plants, and they were buried in this fire ash.
Safe under their blanket, the bulbs will now make good root growth, ready for forcing. In the cut flower bed, Harry has wisely grown several rows of statice, which will provide him with a crop of dried flowers for winter decoration. Picking them at the right time is critical.
This is the statice, the sinuata, and these will be harvested over a period of several weeks. You've got to have the statice out It wants picking in the afternoon when it is completely dry and the flower is out. It's quite papery even at that stage. Tie them up in bundles and hang them upside down and get them dried somewhere where they're going to dry as quickly as possible.
Everlasting flowers, or immortelles as the Victorians called them, have bright, brittle colours. They were often given an extra sparkle to show them off. Jane, Harry's wife, employs a Victorian recipe to achieve this. She dissolves powdered alum in hot water. The effect will come from the crystals that grow as the water evaporates. The book, Domestic Floriculture, promises a glittering prize. Having poured the solution over them, let them remain for at least 12 hours, and then you will find them dry with a sparkling crystal glistening from every spray. When finished, these are beautiful ornaments and last for a considerable time if kept clear from dust.
Morning, John. Good morning.
The immortelle was true to its name in its widespread use as a funeral flower. When there was a death in the family, wreaths of everlasting flowers were sent to the mansion in advance of the funeral. As on other public occasions, it was the head gardener's duty to make up these wreaths.
Gardeners, of course, of days gone by, as many probably still have to today. I still look after family requirements for it. But in days gone by, they always saw to the family memorial flowers. In the beginning, the base of this wreath is exactly the same as the base of any other wreath that I was taught to make. It's a wire foundation which can be bought. In fact, when I was a boy, old gardeners used to make them up themselves. and it's covered with moss. It doesn't have to be moist because remember you're putting dried flowers into it. The wiring of the flowers is exactly the same as you'd wire a live flower, but the majority of these stems are hard and dry and shiny like a varnished surface, so you've got to wire them a bit tighter than you do an ordinary flower. I put a base around here of Statice demosus, which is a lovely white colour. It's fairly solid in the bloom, and it made a good base, and then the helichrysums and acroleoniums were put through the top of this. And when it's put on the ground, you can't see that there's no base there, and this wreath would last for many, many weeks, even out of doors. Several gardeners had the privilege or a perks of being able to make a wreath for anybody on the estate. Usually all you had to buy at my home was the cost of the wires and the foundation, and if you wanted any special flowers, of course, you had to buy the flowers and take them along to the gardener. Sometimes there was one or two members of the garden staff could knock up a wreath and they would do it for anybody working on the estate.
The use of immortals had its critics. One writer spoke disparagingly of wreaths, or rather circlets of yellow flowers, all of precisely the same size, shape and colour. Other flowers were chosen, often to suggest the finer qualities of the deceased. Purity of character and faithfulness found expression in the lily and the violet. But in the teeming cities of Victorian England there was little room for such floral sentiment. Cholera and the exploding population overcrowded London's graveyards. The public were outraged when they learnt that bones were being turned into fertiliser. The response was to create new cemeteries outside the city. At 11 o'clock each day, mourners gathered at a secluded platform on Waterloo Station. They watched the coffin of the deceased carried aboard a railway hearse. They then accompanied it on a 45-minute journey to Woking, to the London Necropolis Company's new cemetery at Brookwood. Here, they would travel into the heart of the cemetery along the company's own branch line.
It drew in alongside this platform. The station, or in this case perhaps one should say the terminus, was well appointed for the needs of the mourners. It had a rest room, refreshment room and bar, and a small room for the priests, near to where the coffins were placed. It was, as one writer put it, the last great station on the railroad of life.
As Surrey Heath became the largest cemetery in Europe, heather, birch and pines, and what the Victorians called trees of sorrow, the weeping ash and elm, produced a landscape where mourners could contemplate the picturesque in a vast garden of sleep. Here they've given immortality to their flowers, hewn in stone. In January 1873, the exiled French Emperor Napoleon III lay in state at the imperial home at Chislehurst in Kent. The Times wrote, "Across the foot of the coffin is laid a large violet wreath." The violet had long been the adopted flower of the Bonapartes. It had also become the favourite flower of England's Queen, so perfectly did it match the mood of her widowhood. Each year, a bunch of the violet named Victoria Regina was sent from Somerset to Balmoral. It was the gift of a loyal subject from Clevedon, a picturesque watering place on the Bristol Channel. He was George Lee, a local market gardener, who found that the well-drained soils of the south-facing hillsides were ideal for early crops of violets. Until the middle of the century, violet varieties were mostly of French origin and not suited to our cool climate. Then hardy stock from Russia gave British growers their chance.
We think this was one of the violet fields long ago.
I joined Jean Burrows, whose detective work identified the site of Lee's nursery. 5 years ago, she stumbled on a mass of violets. Their size and form confirmed their cultivated origin. Remarkably, they seem at home in this wilderness.
And among all these survivors, you think you found a clump of Victoria Regina?
Yes, we're pretty sure this is Victoria Regina because it matches all the descriptions and the illustration in Mr. Lee's article. It is a blue violet rather than a red violet. It has broad petals and rounded tops to the petals, and it flowers much earlier than most. And even these rocks are part of the story, you know. Mr. Lee was rather unsuccessful in his early years of growing violets, and he was losing rather than making money. He hadn't learned the success of cultivating to get long enough stems to be able to bunch them for market. And he was so worried that one day on his return from church in Bristol, he stopped off here to have a long think and a pray. And the story goes that he knelt by these rocks and prayed that Providence would show him what to do next.
And did it?
And when he opened his eyes, so the story goes, he saw growing in a bed of strawberries, some yards distance, the largest and most beautiful violet that he'd ever seen. And because it was a Sunday, and he never worked on a Sunday, he simply marked the spot and came back the next day to propagate this find. And that was the violet that he named after his queen.
Victoria Regina.
That's right, yes.
Through the 70s and 80s, Lee had the lion's share of the violet trade. Tens of thousands of bunches were dispatched each year from Clevedon. In 1883, the Clevedon Mercury noted that our postal bags have become redolent with this once lowly, now queenly perfume. It creeps out of our parcel office to the astonishment of strangers. The French later regained the dominance of the violet market, but Clevedon didn't forget George Lee. Up until the last war, a local chemist was selling violet-scented talcum powder and perfume, labelled Clevedon violets. As the violet grew in popularity, the head gardener had the task of extending its flowering season for as long as possible.
That'll do fine, John. You leave your barrels there. Now each of you get a bundle and bring them to me. This was an old Sussex method I saw. It was faggot wood, as we knew it. That particular estate was placed on the ground, which formed a mild hotbed. Of course, there's no pea sticks, bean rods, hurdle rods, faggots, bavins, whatever you like to call them, copse, on many of these estates today. And of course, nothing in the bavin or the faggot nature was available. I had every other one of a row of black currants cut down, which is a usual practice, and these was bundled up into bundles about the same size as a faggot, and they formed the base. In our case with this, of course, I had to tread it down to get it level and get it solid, because being green sticks, it spread out and is not the same as the bundle of dry wood that the faggot would have been. Bring the barrels along now then, lads, with the leaves. That's the next stage of the operation. Having got the faggots on, of course, then the amount of leaf, the fallen leaf, was placed on and worked down into the brushwood. The leaf stopped the soil going down through the faggots, of course, otherwise you would have needed so much extra soil to fill it up. And they were damp at the time, so, of course, within a few days they started that gentle fermentation, which would cause the heat. Well, throughout the whole operation, as often happens in the garden, of course, we had the company of the garden robin. And it's always a joy when you're digging in the autumn or early in the spring. The robins get quite used to you, and they will keep quite close to you, and they will pick up the grubs and the worms, and they get quite cheeky, and then they get domineering of their territory. In the winter, especially a day like this when the ground is covered with snow, one automatically ambles and lingers longer in the glass houses, especially the warm houses like this tropical house or stove house. You'd be surprised how the staff will take kindly to sponging plants off to clean them of the summer grime and perhaps to get rid of a bit of bug and that sort of thing.
The Victorians loved to bring shrubs into flower ahead of time. The heat and humidity of the glasshouse turns December into spring.
We're going to lift these prunus now. These prunus have been growing here for a couple of years and they're nicely budded up this autumn. Well, the ground, as you can see, is frozen here this morning, but the frost has only gone into the ground an inch or two, and I can easily penetrate it with the spade. That makes no difference at all. We're going to lift them and pop them up and give them a few weeks in one of the cold houses, and then they will be introduced to a very slight warmth which will advance the blooming of them by about a month. And they can then be used, they can either be cut and used as a cut flower or in a group of plants in the house. The flowers, in the amount that many of the ladies had on them, on their dresses and that sort of thing, it's difficult to visualise how they cope with them throughout the evening.
The Victorians loved to wear flowers about their person. It was the duty of the head gardener to ensure that suitable flowers were always available. Today, Harry gathers flowers for a grand musical evening the family are holding at their London residence. During the London season, fresh flowers were sent by train from the country estate up to town, a requirement that no doubt added to a head gardener's headaches. Tonight, these larkspur will decorate the family's London mansion, whilst other flowers from the walled garden will provide bouquets, corsages and garlands to adorn the dresses of the ladies. All had to be packed with the greatest care to ensure they arrived fresh and undamaged.
We had one set of flower hampers here, which provided and supported a wickerwork tray, which fitted down into that. So you were able to put pretty good, substantial flowers in the bottom and your more delicate flowers in the top tray. So when you'd finished packing, the hamper was really full and you was using it to the fullest.
Once in London, the flowers were the responsibility of the lady's maid. The gardener's assistant had good advice for her. The floral headdress must be the very last arrangement to be attached. The longer it can be kept in its box, the better it will look at the end of the evening. But it wasn't just at night that the Victorian woman liked to bedeck herself with flowers. Presentation at court was an opportunity to wear a dress trimmed with eye-catching blooms. For Londoners, the procession to court was a great free show. The Illustrated London News described the barefooted beggar girl with violets for sale, the enthusiastic crowds straining to catch a glimpse of the glittering ladies, immersed in waves of satin, lace, feathers and flowers. See the amazing bouquets worn by the superb retainers in their manly bosoms. These flowers, exclaimed the excited reporter, refresh the ladies' jaded nerves on the journey with bright hues of hothouse floral vegetation, whilst on their way to perform the most serious duty of life. Before one such occasion, a lady to be presented to the Queen was sent a gift from her admirer to boost her morale. It was a bunch of the pale yellow Marischal Niel rose. For the Victorians, yellow was a rare colour, and this variety was a particular favourite. As she dressed for the great day, she attached to her gown a garland of the same fresh-cut roses. The lady was society beauty Mrs. Lily Langtry, and her admirer the Prince of Wales. Through her fame and popularity, she made fashionable the flower that was to be forever associated with her name, the lily. When Japan opened its doors to foreigners in the 1860s, some truly spectacular lilies became available for the first time. It wasn't just the ladies for whom the head gardener had to prepare flowers. By the middle of the century, men were taking to wearing them. In 1874, domestic floriculture described these buttonhole bouquets and coat flowers as becoming very fashionable. The flowers were chosen for their staying power. It was a daily task of the gardener to identify and cut a suitable bloom. The Bourbon rose, La Reine Victoria.
One wants a nice tight bud and a variety that is going to stop in that bud reasonably for, say, 6 hours while it's on the gentleman's buttonhole or whatever you're going to do it for.
A small glass tube was often sewn into the gentleman's lapel to keep the flower fresh for as long as possible.
Well, an ordinary simple buttonhole could be made of 1 rose or 2 roses. You had a variety then of material to put at the back of it. One of the roses' leaves was quite nice, and it was tied neatly round with a bit of thin bass or a bit of cotton. One particular well-known place I was at, the head journeyman or the foreman had to pick a red carnation, and that had to go to the butler's pantry. And I'll never forget it, when there was a local sixpenny op, as we called it, on of a Friday night, the head housekeeper would send down and say that the bus was leaving the courtyard at such and such a time. If any bothy boys cared to go with the staff, they could go to the dance. And if you went to the dance and the gentleman's valet was able to get the time off to go as well, he was wearing his lordship's buttonhole at the dance.
Of the many personalities who sported a daily buttonhole, none was more flamboyant and colourful than Joseph Chamberlain, MP for West Birmingham and father of the future Prime Minister. He was rarely pictured without one, and his flower was nearly always an orchid. At Highbury, his large red brick house on the edge of Birmingham, Chamberlain relaxed, and in between writing his notoriously long political speeches, devoted himself to his other great love, growing orchids. His favourite was the Odontoglossum. Translated, that name means tooth and tongue, which perhaps appealed to his political instincts. Chamberlain had 13 glasshouses devoted to orchids. He eagerly collected newly discovered species, but their rarity made it an attractive proposition to attempt to multiply them from seed. But any head gardener that took on that task was facing a few surprises. The first was how to pollinate the things. They're unlike any normal flower. In fact, you can't find the pollen or the stigma, but under here, there they are, in 2 little pollinia, which can be pressed against the stigmatic surface, which is hidden away inside there. Now, if that's successful, pollination leads to fertilization, and that means the developing seeds will be causing these pods to swell after a few weeks. And a year later, these wonderful sculptured fruits are ready to burst. If we take one off, and open it, the next surprise faces him. Because the seeds are in their hundreds of thousands, and they are tiny. They're the smallest seeds of any flowering plant. And where to sow them? Well, the gardeners found that scattering the seeds around the mother plant was the way that worked the best. But then came the next surprise, because orchid seedlings are, of course, not like any other plant. There's no little stem and 2 leaves after 2 or 3 weeks. No, a year later, and all you've got are these minute blobs of tissue, really like a few cells, no roots and hardly any leaves appearing. And it's not until 12 months after that but there's really recognisable little plants there. And in a further 12 months, they're just about big enough, well, to handle to transplant. And it could be anything up to 10 years before those seedlings flowered. Wealthy collectors got their orchids from nurserymen like James Veitch. These horticultural entrepreneurs funded expeditions to search for new species and hired pistol-packing adventurers to lead them. In their travels, the plant hunters encountered adventures that were the very stuff of boys' own books. They hacked their way through near impenetrable jungles and waded thigh-deep in treacherous swamps. They kept their journeys secret, hoping to reach new plants ahead of their rivals. What they brought back astonished both botanists and gardeners.
This chimney pot-looking object is really a very ancient orchid pot.
It's the design of a Bristol nurseryman, Alexander Moore, inspired perhaps by the chimneys of a nearby colliery. There's no denying that with its orchids in full bloom, the pot will provide a spectacular centrepiece for any soiree.
I've got a cymbidium to place in the top. The ferns, I would imagine, had to go in around the bottom. It was no good putting a pendulous plant and at the bottom of it, otherwise it would be flaring on the deck. These bits of fern should get away and look quite nice in due course. Yes, I can well imagine how beautiful this must have been. How glorious those days must have been when one had plenty of time to really fiddle and look after this sort of thing. Because, of course, one couldn't do a lot of haphazard watering to such a thing as this. It had to be syringed daily and keep it natural moisture to it as if it was growing in the forest. I think a cypripedium would be all right at that height. Mustn't call them cypripediums today, they're paphiopedilliums. But in my days they were known as cyps.
One journalist made his opinion of Mr. Moore's creation very clear. At first, these large pots have not a very inviting appearance, but by and by, as the plants grow, the pots get covered with vegetation, and this disagreeable appearance is done away with. Many flowers enjoyed passing popularity as a fashionable adornment, but it was always the rose to which ladies returned. One constant favourite was this deep red hybrid, General Jacqueminot. What, asked a Victorian romantic, would Napoleon's general have felt had he known that his fame would rest in the heart of a rose, and one so highly favoured by ladies with dark locks? Again, this single flower could be kept fresh by a tube of water concealed in the hair. But if your tresses were of a lighter hue, the choice was not always easy to make. So extreme was the fashion for floral trimmings that it became impossible to wear fresh flowers on every occasion. Many dresses were designed with artificial flowers, made of wax, silk, and a whole range of materials. Great care was taken to be as botanically accurate as possible. These hats on display at the Exeter Costume Museum give some idea of the detail and realism of fabric flowers. In some cases, real materials, like this lattice of twigs and dried leaves, are mixed with the artificial creations. Making sure their mistress looked her best for the great occasion required close collaboration between head gardener and lady's maid. The ideal flowers were not always available, but fortunately fashion allowed several styles of headdress. In selecting flowers, preference should be given, wrote the gardener's assistant, to those of a thick, fleshy character, since they look well out of water for the longest time. Ideal was Lapageria rosea. And Stephanotis. A gardener can do much towards a successful evening by selecting flowers that are not overblown and foliage that is not too young or soft. Finally, a lady's maid who takes pride in her work likes to see her mistress return from a party with her ornaments and decorations looking as fresh as at the beginning of the evening.
I don't know whether the young lady would like to hear me say it or not, but I do think she was a bit of a fidget, and I don't think the flowers stood a chance on her at all. The flowers had to last upwards of 6 hours, which was quite a time for a flower in a warm room, a lady dancing with a gentleman, and taking refreshments and sitting down in chairs and that. It's very, very difficult to visualise how some of those flowers came through the evening. But we came through, and I'm very proud to have been part of that evening, which really did belong to the past, and nothing that I'd been privileged to take part in at any time before in my life.
In the high Victorian summer of 1870, few could have foreseen the winter ahead. 2 great wars were to uproot the seemingly secure world of the head gardener. His walled garden became a place out of time. For a young journeyman like Harry Dodson on the threshold of his career, the outbreak of war in 1939 was a moment of confused emotions.
I knew that I would only have a very few weeks before I was gone, and I did have many look-arounds to see the plants that we'd looked after and to see the gardens, and it was really too sad for words. It was quite stunning to know that it had all got to go and what was going to happen. But it was great to go back and see some of the plants which had been kept, and the old hands that was left was telling you, well, we'll build them back up again when you come back, and we really thought that was going to happen, sort of thing, overnight, which it didn't.